So officially, welcome to our July webinar. This afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are, or tonight, we'll be talking about the urge to pick. We will be exploring the psychology behind the urge. Before I start, I want to remind everyone that there's an active poll so that you can vote and select your topic for August. Once I'm done with this, let's say my part of the webinar, I will close the poll and then say what our topic will be in August, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So these are some of the things that we will be talking about tonight. First, I will show you a brief dialogue from a session that I had with a client. So it wasn't a SkinPick client, it was a client from my own private practice, but these are the kinds of dialogues that I have very often with clients in SkinPick. And then I will tell you why is it so important to look at the meaning of the urge if we actually want to deal with it in a useful way. And then we'll talk a little bit about conceptualizing the urge theoretically. Here, I don't mean that I'm going to go and then throw a lot of psychological theory on you. I'm going to try and start with the obvious and then kind of guide you step by step so that you can see that when we talk about psychological theory, it's not just empty theorizing, that it actually has to do with your direct experience. And then we're going to ask George Kelly for advice and see what he has to say. If this is your first time here, then just briefly, George Kelly is a psychologist that I have an obsession with, and I think I mentioned him in every webinar that we've had, at least insofar as to say that I didn't mention Kelly in the webinar towards the end, just so that his name is recorded somewhere. Then I'm going to show you everything that we've talked about in action on an example from one of the clients from SkinPick, actually. And then we will go to the Q&A. As I'm going through the presentation, as always, use the button that you have on your screens that says Q&A and then ask your questions. If there's any part of this that you're unsure about, that you would like me to talk more about, or just, any question that you may have. So because of my ability to infinitely digress, let's get started quickly. So let's start with a dialogue. So C would be for a client and VM would be me. So a client comes, struggles with skin picking, and then tells me it's just a bad habit, nothing more. I say, it looks more than that to me, because for a bad habit, you don't come to psychotherapy. The client says, no, really, it's just a habit. It's irrational and it's stupid. And then I say, just being annoying as I am, well, why do you do it if it's just bad, if it's just a bad habit? If it's stupid, why are you doing it? And then the client says, I don't know, I just do. I'm weak, I can't resist. So then I ask, do you do things for no reason? And then the client makes sure to emphasize the difference. And he says, I am not irrational, if that's what you're implying. Picking is irrational. I just get the urge to do it, and then I go to the mirror and find something to pick. So then I just kind of summarize the experience. So you first get the urge, and then you go find something to pick. If you're in the program and I happen to be your therapist, you'll notice that I often ask this: what came first? Then the client says, yes, that's right. I feel the urge. So first, and then I say, can you describe it to me? And the client says, well, it's here. And then he points to his chest. And because we're talking about an online session, since, we live in times when we don't spend time in the same room, he kind of has to kind of stand up a little bit and then points to his chest. And then he adds, but it's irrational. There's no reason for it. It just happens. So I say, what happens? And the client says, this tension builds up. It's almost like I'll explode if I don't pick. I must pick. It sounds intense, I say, and the client nods. But why do you say it's irrational? And then the client responds, well, there's no reason for it. There is no tension in my chest before, meaning I just feel the tension, but it's not really there. Does it make sense to say that you call it irrational because you don't understand it? And then the client says with some hesitation, well, I guess, but what are you saying? And that was exactly what I was saying. You're calling it irrational because you don't understand it. And this is very common. And I think, at least in my opinion, and in the way that I approach therapy, calling something irrational is usually a hindrance, not a way to progress. The question to ask is, how is this logical? Or how does this make sense? Not to just write something off as unreasonable. And hopefully by the end of the webinar, I will have convinced you of this. So when we talk about why something is logical or why something is rational, we're talking about meaning. In fact, meaning has a central place in psychology ever since Freud. But the way that Freud approached meaning was basically the way we approach learning languages. Like you have a dictionary, you look up a word, and that's what it is. You know, if it's a church, it's a penis. If it's a lake, it's a vagina. Simple as that. Obviously, I mean, I'm parodying a little bit. It's not as simple as that. But if you've read Freud's interpretation of dreams, and if you haven't, by all means do, it's a fascinating book, you will see that he has this kind of rigid idea of what represents what. In my opinion, this is not what we need. It was useful, and it's a good dictionary if you want to understand, you know, like the fin de siècle Vienna. But if you want to understand anyone in the world circa now, you need something different. So when I talk about looking at meaning of things, what I actually mean is looking at their function and their context and how they interact with each other. We will get to how this specifically relates to the urge, but as I so often do, I will start with a work of art because I think it's a very good way to get my point across. And the work of art that we will be talking about is this, what you see behind the words. This red square by Malevich, the Russian painter. When I was younger, like a lot younger, I used to love browsing through art books. I was raised in a family that wasn't rich by any stretch of imagination, but we had tons of books and like thousands of them, and many of them were about art. And so I loved to go through all of them. This is partially why I know so much about art, because it was a topic in my family. And to this day, we have very passionate arguments where some of them are wrong and I'm right. Anyways, I used to love books about early 20th century art. I don't, even to this day, I don't quite know why, but a lot of the avant-garde art really resonated with me. And then one day, like I was a kid, we're talking about 12, 13, 14, so I had really no intellectual capacity to grasp that art, but I just thought it was fascinating to look at. And then one day, as I was browsing through these books, I came across this painting. It's very simple. I looked at it and I thought, meh, you know, it's just what it is. There's nothing there. Then my eyes went down a little bit and I read the title of the painting. And this is the name, Red Square, Painterly Realism of a Peasant Woman in Two Dimensions, from 1915 by Kazimir Malevich. And then I looked back up and I thought, this is a Russian peasant in 2 dimensions and a woman, no less. And there was something, I didn't understand it quite at the time, but there was something that made no freaking sense whatsoever to me, that this could possibly be a Russian woman in 2 dimensions or 15 dimensions, you know, at that. It was just like a poorly painted red square on a white background. And then, needless to say, when you get intrigued by something, you want to read and learn more. At least I do. So for me, that means looking at the context. So seemingly, this painting is just, you know how people often say about modern and contemporary art, my child could do it? Well, when you see this, that is what you reasonably think. And then when you see that it is actually a peasant woman in 2 dimensions, you really can't help but think that someone's crazy here. So for me, that means, my God, let's dig in deeper, which I did. And I started reading, and I couldn't really quite follow everything because I was very, very young. But now, from a distance, I think I can explain it a little better. And I will do it in just a second. And hopefully, you will understand afterwards why this actually is a peasant woman in 2 dimensions. So I found the website when I was making the presentation because I was looking for a high resolution image of the painting. And I found a website dedicated exclusively to Malevich. And this is a part of a description of that painting. It says he also effectively contrasts colors, such as the active feeling of red with the passiveness of white in the red square, which is the painting we're talking about. Malevich believed both colors represented all colors of the spectrum, and by using both, he was showcasing all color. So without going into the details about his theory of colors, you can see that the point is in the interaction between these 2 colors and also obviously the shape. So what do you see when you look at the painting? It's not even a square. Like if you look carefully, it's not a full square. It's kind of tilted a little bit, right? It's a little bit deformed. It's kind of like when you put too much stuff in your closet and then the closet just moves slightly to one side. I don't know if you ever had that experience, because I sure do often enough, because my idea of cleaning up is just shoving everything in the closet because then the room looks clean. And then that's exactly what happens. It kind of moves slightly to the right. So it's not a perfect square. And then look at the color distribution. I promise you this is going somewhere. So what we see on the outside is the passive white, as he says. And what we see on the inside is the active red. Now, if you're Slavic or Russian, which I'm not, but I'm, mostly Slavic, so I do know something about Slavic cultures. Color red is kind of important and special and has important symbolism. I dare say it's a color that you can mostly only see worn by women. Maybe not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. And it is an active color. It's about passion and power. So what you see here is this kind of frame of this passive white that is basically pressing on this core of very active, powerful, and passionate red. And together, according to Malevich, they contain all color. So you have everything there, but it's all tightly packed into this passive white. And the reason why I was mentioning the tilting and the kind of slightly deformed shape is because the way that these 2 shapes interact kind of emphasize this pressure. If you think about early 20th century, you don't even have to think about Russia in particular. You can think about any part of the world, mostly women weren't exactly the freest, constituents of a society, right? And mostly women were more passive politically, socially. And that's what you see on the outside. But and then you can see how this passive whiteness kind of oppresses this active dynamic red. So basically what he's saying is that Russian peasant women need to be liberated. And when I give you all that context, and when you see all this, how can you resist thinking that this is something a child could do, when there's quite a lot of thought that has to go into something so simple that contains so much? So something that might appear to be a meaningless red square actually contains a wealth of information. I see that a lot of you are raising your hands, and some of you are asking questions because I see the number of questions. So if you have a question about this, just ask the question in the Q&A, and I will answer it. So in order for us to actually understand this painting, we need to know about the time when it was painted, about the artist's intentions, about the techniques that he was using, and so on. Hopefully now, when you look at this red square or his black square later on, not in this presentation, but he actually has it. He painted that as well. You will think about these things because these things make up the context that gives meaning to this painting. Without the context, you can freely say my child could have done it. With the context, I mean, I am absolutely sure your child is intelligent, just perhaps not that intelligent. So, in order to understand an object, any kind of phenomenon, or a person at that, we have to understand its meaning and its proper context. Its meaning tells us why and how it's logical, so that we don't dismiss it as unreasonable, irrational nonsense, which is what people often do with modern art. And this is why I often showcase different paintings and then explain the logic behind them, because I find it really fascinating how people, what they don't understand, they so easily dismiss as being crazy or just stupid. And this is something that people often do with the urge to pick as well, because it is so difficult to understand, because there's no universal recipe. Like what I just told you about the red square, you cannot apply to Kandinsky, for example, because he had his own theory of colors and because he had his own life story and his own politics. I will later on come back to this, but let me just give you another little detail, because meaning is not just as simple as what I described, even though what I just described is not simple at all. Around 1920, so this was painted before the Russian Revolution, which was in 1917. And then sometimes around 1920, I'm talking now literally from the memory of when I was a kid. So I'm not sure whether it was in his diary or in an interview or somewhere. What he said kind of hints at what I just interpreted from this painting, which is that he said that this was the red square of an artistic revolution. You know, saying that after the Red Revolution gives it an additional layer, a kind of political and social context as well. Context that may not have been present while he was painting it, but because of the historical circumstances that were happening, and the meaning also evolved. So not only is meaning difficult to discover because it depends on the context, it also evolves and changes over time. When we talk about people and human psychology, we're talking about our cultural context, our family, our immediate surroundings, our personal experiences. So let me just give you a few points here. The way we think and feel, sorry, I just got distracted for a second because I forgot that I pressed record, and that would not be good. So the way that we think and feel evolves from our past experiences. I hope that makes sense to you. So we mostly organize our new experiences based on our previous experiences. So when something new happens, what you first try to do is reach for the archives of what happened to you before, and then you try to fit that in somewhere, right? By doing this, you're likely kind of changing the old experiences a little bit because you're adding something new. The way that we organize our experiences, according to Kelly and me and every other constructivist on planet Earth, is in constructs. Like in CBT, for example, we talk about cognitive schemas. So different theories will use different words, but they will vaguely refer to the same process. I prefer the constructivist language for the webinars because I think of all the psychological theories, constructivism has the most precise and most elaborate language to talk about meaning making. So we say that we organize experiences in constructs, meaning that what happens to you, you kind of extract a principle from that. And let's say that this is what we call a construct. So we have many of them because our experiences are different. They take place in different contexts in our lives. And the way in which these constructs interact with each other, their interrelationships, is actually what generates meaning. So meaning is never to be found in one construct only. It's really the interplay of all the constructs that we have. If you remember when I was talking about this in our previous webinars, I used to put a picture of a pyramid showing that there's a hierarchy of these constructs and they're not all the same or all equally important. So there's many of them and they kind of talk to each other, if that makes sense. And so just to reiterate my point, meaning is a way to understand why and how something is logical and reasonable. Another example, but I'm not going to go into this. I'll let you do the research. Look at the concrete blocks behind you. I mean, you could say they're concrete blocks, but if you know what this is, you'll know the deep and important symbolism that this has, and how profoundly important they are, and how much meaning is contained within them. But they are concrete blocks. But their importance comes from what they represent and where they are and what the context of it is. Okay, so let's try and give some psychological structure to what we're talking about here. I'm going to start with the surface, like just with the surface level experience of what clients usually tell me. And then we will give this fancy psychological names, and then I will tell you what we can do with those fancy psychological names. But I want you to be able to follow everything step by step. So I guess most of you perhaps will agree with this. So the urge is vague, meaning that it's very difficult to explain with words. If I ask you what the urge feels like, usually the answers I get are these words that mean everything and nothing, like it's uncomfortable, or it's tension, or it's just a feeling, or something like this. Like basically it's not very precise. There's a difference when you say I'm sad and when you say I feel this thing that's somewhere but nowhere in particular, and so on. So it's usually very vague. It can feel quite intense, and generally we can say that it's on the unpleasant spectrum. I'm yet to hear someone saying that they just love feeling the urge to pick. However, even though it's so vague, there is a very clear guide for action. There's no ambivalence there. Like there's difficulty putting it into words, but the call to action is very clear. Pick. Pick now. So even though the experience itself is not precise, what comes out of that experience is very precise. And then what we also know is that picking alleviates the urge to pick, which is really just extremely obvious. And then what we also know is that it always comes back, right? So you pick, it goes away, and then after a while, it comes back. I hope most of you would agree with most of these points. Not everyone's the same. So when I'm making the webinar for like hundreds of you that are here, I kind of have to put it in words that would resonate with most of you. So let's try and find psychological terms to explain each of these. So that when we get to the part about what to do with it, and when we start relying on Kelly's technical language, so that you know exactly what I mean and that you can relate it to your experience. So let's translate. Vagueness and this difficulty of putting the urge into words means that we're dealing with something that we call a nonverbal construct. A nonverbal construct is a way to structure our experience without using words. Little kids, which is not at all redundant to say, kids, they mostly use nonverbal construing. Like when you're a baby, when you're very young, you still haven't adopted language. You're still not kind of indoctrinated in the symbolic system of our culture. So you don't know how vitally important language is. So you make distinctions based on feelings, right? So this trend continues when we grow up as well, although a good, or I guess most of our construing then becomes verbal once we adopt language. And the reason why it becomes verbal is because when we use language, other members of our culture understand us very easily. So language is not only a way to give structure to our internal experiences, it's a way for us to communicate them precisely to others. And it also gives us clear guides for action, because that's what we want. That's the point of having constructs, is so that you can interact with the world. So here we're dealing with a nonverbal construct. I'm going to go on a slight digression here, but I promise it also makes sense, and I will try to tie it in. Actually, no. I'm just looking at the slide, so let me just go down a little bit. The fact that it's intense and very unpleasant says that it's quite important. So we call it a superordinate construct. There's the subordinate one, which is low in the hierarchy, and then the superordinate one, which is higher up in the hierarchy. It can be in the middle, it can be in the very top. That really depends from person to person. But it is a superordinate construct because of how important it is, right? Picking is a translation. So you feel this nonverbal mess of things, and then you translate that as I have to pick. So the idea, or like the act of going in front of a mirror, for example, is how you translate this nonverbal thing that's happening to you. It's the meaning that you attribute to it. The meaning is given in the act of translating it. And then the fact that it's alleviated once you finish or while you're picking, it acts as a kind of validation of your translation. So you say, okay, I must have understood these feelings good because it went away, the urge. And then, so alleviation, we interpret as validation for our construct, right? And then the fact that it has this recurrent nature means that it is a psychological need. And psychological needs don't go away. We can satisfy them in many different ways, but they are a part of who we are, a part of simply what makes us human beings. I hope this was clear to you, because this is quite a big jump from what is an ordinary experience for people struggling with skin picking to a lot of psychological lingo. So I hope the transition wasn't very difficult. So let's see what Kelly says. What is not verbal ought to become verbal. If we want to change in a way, in a direction that we can consciously influence, so that we can direct our change where we want it to be, then we have to put it into words, because words give us the precision that we need, right? One thing when we talk about constructivism that we always have to keep in mind is that any translation is just an interpretation. Not all interpretations are obviously equally good, equally accurate, equally precise, but it means that the interpretation of the urge as I have to pick is just one of many interpretations. And so this is the point that I was going to make in the previous slide, but then I remembered this, and so I'm going to make it now. How you will interpret something depends on your vocabulary. Your vocabulary depends on the culture that you belong to. It depends on the family that you grew up in. It depends on what happened to you in your life and the kinds of private constructs you've developed over time. And to make things complicated, it also depends on how all this interacts together. Just to give you like a very, I think, obvious example, let's look at human languages. So we don't even have to talk about individual experiences. If there are people here in this webinar who are bilingual, trilingual, or more than that, you know that sometimes when you speak one language, you have to basically speak for 5 minutes to say something that you can say with one word in another language. That means that different systems of constructs have different ways of conceptualizing. So what can be easily understood in one system may have no meaning at all in another system. So to give you an example, if you've ever read Milan Kundera's book, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, if you haven't, just go to Amazon right now, buy that and Unbearable Lightness of Beings and Joke, because those are the classics of 20th century literature. But just kidding. So he introduces this Czech term called litost, which I may be mispronouncing since I don't speak Czech, which basically means this kind of desperation that comes from a sudden realization of one's own misery. I remember when I was reading this that I was quite fascinated that there is a word for this, because I had that experience. I just had no description for it. I didn't have a word for it. There are many languages that have this. Like in English, there are some certain languages, certain words that are probably untranslatable, like the word awkward, for example. I'm trying to think I'm fortunate enough to speak several languages on a daily basis. So I'm trying to think of a translation. Like awkward could maybe, in Italian, you can say scomodo, but that would mean more like physically uncomfortable, but it wouldn't include that embarrassment component that awkward has. But then you can say, yeah, I can't think of a translation. So awkward would be one word that perhaps you can only clearly define in English, but maybe not so easily if you're a speaker of another language. Then let's say Hungarian has like dozens and dozens of untranslatable feelings. Um, and now when I need an example, I can't think of one. Karörem, that's translatable. That's like Schadenfreude. Um, Elvagyodás, for example, I think that's a good example. So elvagyodás is a feeling of kind of being this of wanting to be displaced. Yeah, this is going to be a tough one to explain. So it's like not wanting to be where you are, but also not really having the energy to go anywhere, and also not knowing where you want to go. So it's not like wanderlust, where you would just like to go and explore the world. It's also not about traveling, like I want to go to, I don't know, Stockholm, and then you go on a plane. It's more about sort of not feeling okay where you are and wanting to be elsewhere, but not having the agency or the knowledge to go there. That would be elvagyodás. Like there's just one word to cover all this nonsense that I just spouted out. So if you speak only English and you feel this, then you struggle to actually put it into words. So for you, by default, it's nonverbal. But if you're Hungarian, like this, you know a word for it. Slavic languages also have quite a number of these. Um, for example, well, let's say Serbo-Croatian, so that I don't get into these post-Yugoslav political differences. You have a lot of words like sevdah, like if there's anyone from Bosnia or Serbia or Croatia listening to this, there's no way in hell you don't know what sevdah is, but good luck explaining that feeling. Or for example, merak, which I don't like the word. I think it's an ugly word, but I think it expresses something really beautiful that you can't quite say in English in one word. It's that feeling when something so mundane and banal fulfills you to the point where it gives your life meaning. Like, like you can have just a good cup of coffee, for example, and that can just be everything you need. Like that can be the point of living. Or just something so silly, everyday, not philosophical, right? So, whereas in English, you kind of have to struggle to find the words. If you're a speaker of one of those languages, like one of the Yugoslav languages, you can just say merak and everyone will know what you mean, and you will know what you mean. And when you know what you mean, you know exactly what to do with it. And the same principle applies to our own psyche. As we grow up, we evolve different languages to explain our internal experiences. And then let's say if you were born in a family where you don't really talk about emotions all that much, you kind of perhaps have a poor vocabulary to explain away your emotions. So you will say, there's like happy, sad, and uncomfortable, which is everything else. And then when the urge comes about, you simply don't have the psychological way to understand what's happening. So it becomes very, very disturbing. So the importance of what Kelly has to tell us is that we can take this set of sensations and then translate them in a different way. And when you translate something in a different way, it will give you different tools to deal with what's happening. So picking is one way to translate, one guide for action. But because you can apply a different interpretation, a different translation, you can have many more guides for action, not just picking. And this is, I think, the main psychological tool that not just constructivists, but any CBT therapist would use. Even a psychoanalyst, I dare say, only they would never put it in those words. Another lesson that we can learn from constructivism is that we can't escape our psychological needs. We can and should find healthier and better resources to deal with our needs, But we are, for better or worse, beings that always depend on other humans and on other things. We're usually unaware of this. And we like to think of ourselves as being very independent because our dependency is so built into the way that we live that we don't actually even notice it. But think about it. I remember the first time, it's been like a decade ago, when I went to Cuba and I had my US phone number, or was it a European number? I'm not sure. It was a long time ago, but it was a phone number. And when I came to Cuba, I realized that I have no cell reception. It doesn't work. But I don't care to speak on the phone, so that was fine. But then I realized that I don't have internet. I never before imagined that I was a person that's really dependent on internet for anything. But suddenly I realized that I actually can't text any of my friends. And I do that all the time. I text with my friends all day. What else does one do if not exchange ridiculous memes and news articles with friends? Then I realized that when I travel, I'm a nerd, so I like to learn about stuff. So I will Google everything I see. But you can't do that if you don't have internet, can you? And then came the most terrifying insight, which is that you can't use Google Maps if there is no internet. So for the first 4 days in Cuba, the first time I went there, I literally had the desire to take a fork and stick it in my eye because that is how much I missed the internet. And I remember when I was going back, I had this long layover at the airport. I spent like 7 hours online, completely detached from the rest of the world. And it was really, truly, genuinely up to that point that I had no idea that I depend on the internet so much. And then during the course of my stay, the first time when I went to Cuba, I realized something, that when you don't have internet, you actually speak to other people and you make friends offline, in person, like with strangers in the streets. How perverse. So I had to learn this skill of talking to strangers. Like you go outside and there's a person there and you can talk to them. So I had to find other ways to fulfill my needs that internet would fulfill. So usually I'm an introvert, so I don't go around talking to strangers. But in Cuba, I realized that yes, you can actually approach a person in the street and then say, hey, I'm looking for this. Can you help me? Or this is a pretty building. Do you know what it is? And then they tell you if they know. And if they don't know, then you just ask someone else. So I had to find other resources to replace this resource that internet was. But I couldn't find one resource. I had to find several of them. But you cannot escape the fact that you need what you need. Internet is a resource that we depend on. Just you wouldn't be here without internet, would you? Without electricity, how would you cook? How would you wash your stuff? And this is not even talking about other people. So this is how we depend on these objects. And each of these objects were made by other people. So indirectly, even if you don't depend on your loved ones, you depend on Chinese workers who made your iPhone, for example, underpaid Chinese workers who made your iPhone. So in a sense, we are profoundly dependent. I think this is also an area of overlap that constructivism has with religions like Buddhism and even Christianity that sort of emphasize our interconnectedness. So no matter how independent and strong we like to be, we cannot escape our psychological needs. And very often the urge has this component of people thinking they're weak if they need a tool to deal with something, as if everything else we do in life is, just not without resources. Just recently in the program, I was talking to a client who said, well, I feel defeated every time I need a competing response. And I said, do you feel defeated every time you need a glass to drink water? Because that's a tool that you use. Only you don't think of that as being shameful or guilt-inducing, so you're fine with that kind of dependency, but you depend on it. So for better or worse, we cannot go beyond our psychological needs. We can reinterpret them and translate them in different ways so that we can satisfy them in a way that's healthy for us and sustainable, but we cannot get rid of them. So when people often ask me, Will I ever feel the urge again? I can never say no, because maybe you won't feel that intensity or that specific quality, but the needs that are behind the urge are legitimate needs you need to take care of. And when you don't, you will feel them again. It's like you eat, and then when you need to eat again, you feel hunger. Then you eat, you stop feeling hunger, and then when you need to eat again, you feel hunger. The trick is that sometimes hunger can also mean sadness, because people often eat to cope with emotions. So it kind of, this is where things get complicated, and you have to be very careful about how you differentiate your needs, right? And one more thing that Kelly would say is that a need is best satisfied with several rather than one resource. And when people talk about picking as being an addiction, or at least feeling like one, this is what they're talking about. When picking becomes the only resource that we have for something, then it feels like an addiction, because you just can't live without it. Like, there's really no other way to satisfy the urge but to pick. And this is why it feels like an addiction, because this resource is just kind of vitally important. You feel like you can't survive without it. And Kelly says, I think I even put that quote. No, I didn't. So I will quote it now. Kelly said that the best way to deal with our needs is to put them in a lot of small packages and send them to as many addresses as possible. So that way, when one resource is not available, you have many others as well. And that doesn't eliminate your dependence, but in a way, it makes you independent, because you don't depend on any resource in particular. Like, if you look at what countries do with resources, unless they're led by very dumb people, they're not going to put all their eggs in one basket. They will diversify. You don't want to build a country around, like, let's say you're talking about economy. You don't want to build your country's economy around one resource, whatever that is. Because if it's just one resource, then you're vitally dependent on it. That means you're easily controlled and easily manipulated, or impoverished, depending on who your neighbors are. And the same goes for our psyche. When we have only one way to satisfy a desire, a need, we're in trouble. When we have two ways, we're still in trouble, but not as much. When we have five ways, we're fine, because the likelihood of all five failing is very, very low. Just to be clear, I use these numbers as an orientation. So for now, I hope it's clear that when we're talking about the urge, we're actually talking about a psychological need that we translate as the urge to pick, and that there are different ways in which we can translate it. And that Kelly always advises us to put things into words. So how do we actually do that? What's the method for doing this? First, I have to say that it's a slow process and it takes time. There are several types of nonverbal construing, and I don't want to complicate things by going into theoretical details. Sometimes it's easier, most of the time it's slow. I remember when I was in my own therapy, which in Europe, when you're in training to become a therapist, you need at least 250 hours of your own therapy. That means once a week, every week for 5 years, providing that your therapist never gets sick or you never get sick, which never happens. So it lasts like forever. And I remember I like precision and I like to have a clear definition of something. And sometimes I would struggle with this. And then in my own therapy, I would rush to put everything into words as soon as possible. And my therapist would tell me, like ad nauseum, don't rush, take it easy. I know it's confusing, but it will clarify itself over time. So now I'm telling you this. It took me forever to learn this lesson. You probably won't take my advice, but be very patient with yourselves. When you're trying to convert something into words or symbols that you can use, it does really take time, because the process is not to jump into intellectual conversation. The process is to slowly collect elements. So if you've ever been in therapy, or if you're in our program, your therapist is likely asked you questions like, Do you know anything that feels similar? What does this remind you of? When you think of this, what comes to your mind? When psychoanalysts ask you to free associate, what they're doing is they're collecting elements. And there is a big spectrum from vague sensations to clear verbal definitions. So there's a lot of stuff in between. Sometimes I will ask you to describe how something feels in your body or where it is. I like to start there because I think that's a very basic, useful point. But then there are things that we maybe cannot put quite into words, but we can imagine, so we can have a picture in our minds. Sometimes this is one of the reasons why I like to use art, because I think art can stimulate a lot of this. And you will see in the example that I will give you how my client used poetry to find proper verbal labels for her own needs. And the reason why I put this, this is a painting by René Magritte. It's called The Lovers. And I really like it because love is very often about projection. So when we're kissing someone, we're not actually seeing them. We're kissing the image that we have in our heads. So I kind of really like this painting. Anyway, it's a slow process and it takes time. The trick is to collect elements. So you never ask yourself, what is this? You ask, or why am I feeling this? You're asking, how does this feel? What does it feel like? Where is it in my body? What does it remind me of? So you want to gather as many elements as you can. You write it down. You talk about it with your therapist. You send us a message if you're in SkinPick. You collect these elements. They're like pieces of a puzzle. I like to start with the body, as I said, because the body is usually how our unconscious mind speaks. And then we start from there. For some people, it can be visual imagery. And then very often when we have these webinars, people will comment on the artworks and share their impressions, or they will email me later on and say, like, what was that painting you used, or something like this. Because for some people, the visual part resonates. For others, it's music. Sometimes, even, for example, sometimes I can't maybe define how I feel, but I can often tell you what the soundtrack for that is. And sometimes I will obsessively play certain musical pieces because they weirdly help me kind of symbolize what's happening inside of me. And then with the repetition, I slowly get the words and other associations. I remember it was a long, long time ago. I had broken up with someone, and it was like a decade-long relationship. And those relationships when you're compatible with someone to the extent that you think that you will never need another relationship, and when you love someone so much that you can't really imagine being with anyone else, and then slowly over time that erodes, and then comes a point where you realize you have to break up, and that kind of destroys your world. Well, that's what happened to me, as we all have that experience. And when we're young, and when we experience that for the first time, it's earth-shattering. Like, there are no similar experiences. There's nothing to compare it to, because it feels like amputation. It feels like it's like literally you lost a part of your body. And I remember at that time, I was very confused and didn't know how to process all these things. And I had tickets to a concert, and the concert was Martha Argerich, the pianist that I admire very much. And well, I actually like her so much that if there was a concert of her just sitting on stage, combing her hair, I would pay to see it. And she was playing Prokofiev's Third Piano Concerto, which is a stunning masterpiece of classical music. And so the first movement goes, the second movement goes, everything's wonderful and great. And then the third movement starts. And suddenly I start resonating with it in a very intense way. Like, it starts off very peacefully, but then it kind of picks up and becomes very intense. It's basically this crazy argument. It's a shouting match between the orchestra and the pianist. And so at times it becomes very violent, very anxiety-inducing, very aggressive. And then it becomes sad and melancholic. And there's this feeling of loss and then struggle against the loss. And then it ends in this incomprehensible, I don't even know how they play it, like how their fingers do what they do, but it ends in this cathartic mess of notes and everything. And I remember ending the concert, I wasn't playing it, but I was listening to it, literally in tears. And I was so moved by it that I really didn't even care that I was crying in front of all these people in a rather snobbish, pretentious, prestigious concert venue, because I was so moved by the intensity of the music. And that actually gave me a starting point in healing from that relationship, because I went home and I actually had a different recording of hers, of that concerto. And then I kept obsessively playing this until other elements came to my mind. And then the more elements I had, the more I was able to put it in different boxes and make sense of it. And then eventually put it into words and find a way to move on. So gathering elements is more important than defining. And now I'm going to show you exactly, oh, I did one more slide, sorry, forgot about that one. So the first step would obviously be acceptance, because as I said, your needs are just not going to go away. And because you don't like having them, your needs don't really care. They're still there. So you have no choice but to accept and work with them constructively. You understand the needs by doing what I just described, sort of finding different elements and then seeing what they have in common, what are the themes that keep overlapping, and through experimentation, trying out different things. And then I did quote Kelly, so no need to do it again. And one way to think about the urge to pick, especially when you've been picking for many years, is to think of it as an onion. And yes, I do mean an onion, which is that if by now that's not clear in constructivism and also in CBT, the reason why I also emphasize also in CBT is because the program, that allows us to meet here is a program that's based on cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT is just something that I bring in because it's my personal taste, but we basically work with CBT. So CBT always talks about and constructivism about why we have a symptom, like what function does it perform. Some people will call it secondary gain. In constructivism, we straight up call it the function of the symptom. When symptoms last and when they're present in our lives for a very long time, they tend to acquire more than one function, which makes this process rather complicated, because you can find one set of meanings or identify one need that can lessen the urge, but it's still there because there are other layers of meaning. And this kind of, these like different layers that an onion has, this is also what the urge has. And the longer it's been there, likely the more layers it has. And this is why I emphasize patience, because sometimes you might think, there, now I get it. And then 2 days later, you realize that there's like 5 layers beneath. So it's kind of like a process of gradual discovery. It's like archaeology. That might be a more tasteful metaphor than onions, but there you go. So I'm going to give you an example. So this is a 54-year-old client from SkinPick, and she gave me permission to use this description as an example. And she has been struggling with skin picking since her early teens. So quite a few decades of skin picking there. At the beginning of our treatment, she was already able to connect picking with stress and what she would call uncomfortable feelings. Now, if you know me, you know that I'm not a hateful person, but I do have a lot of hatred for the word uncomfortable, because this is a way to explain absolutely nothing. So we worked on making a more precise description of the urge. I used a lot of mindfulness techniques, and she practiced a lot of body scans to develop body awareness so that she can give me a precise description. And also because there are other benefits, obviously. And so this is what she described. It starts in my chest as some sort of internal tingling, and then it becomes pressure, an envelope that hugs my lungs and prevents me from inhaling deeply. So I start to breathe in completely. Some of the tingling coalesces in my neck and becomes a lump. The lump just stands there. Sometimes I'm afraid I won't be able to swallow. It just stands there. So this is how this client described the urge to me. So let's see what we have. First, we have this tingling. It's very vague. Then, as she observes it more, she sees two distinct layers of sensations. I hope you were also able to identify this from the text. There's the envelope around her lungs that makes her breathing shallow and gives her the impression that she just doesn't have enough air. And then there's another layer, which is a lump in her throat. As she says, it just stands there. Both of these layers of experience lead to the same outcome, which is picking. So the evolution of the urge is from left to right, so from tingling to picking. But the way that we analyze it is from the right side to the left. So just disregard the picking part and then start with this and then go to the left. So the instruction that I gave her, and we worked over a period of time. So for each of these, she had an assignment, which is pay attention to your body as you go through your day. And whenever you feel any of these, so the lump or the envelope or the you can't breathe or the shallow breathing, so any of these, write down what's happening, what you're thinking about. Where are you? Who are you talking to? It's like any details, whatever comes to your mind, whatever you can observe, just write it down. And she did. And she would update the worksheets regularly with these new insights. And then after a while, when we gathered sufficient information, we decided to analyze what we had. And so here are some elements that she gathered. So for the first package, when I say the first package, I mean the upper sort of layer here, the envelope around her lungs, so the breathing part. So when is it that she feels that? When she has to open work emails in the morning, when she has first dates that she would occasionally go on, she was divorced, when her kids were little and they wouldn't stop crying, when a package is delivered late, when she's reading an exciting novel. And this image here, this is what she sent me. And she said, this is also what makes me feel that way. I don't know where she found the image, but that's the image that she sent. Look how diverse these elements are. Yet they all share something similar with the urge. So our next step was to classify them and see what they have in common. Again, if you're in the program and you happen to be working with me, you might find some of this familiar because this is the method that I like to employ very often. Then the second package, the lump. The lump was difficult, and there were fewer elements for the lump. I will present only one because most of the elements were, my client worked sort of, I guess you can say that she was a writer in a sense, but her ambition was to be a poet. And she read a lot of poetry and wrote a lot of poetry that was never published because she was kind of afraid of it. So she sent me a part of a poem by Anne Carson, and she introduced me. For this, I will be eternally grateful to this client for introducing me to Anne Carson and her poetry. She sent me this. So here is what the lump is for her. I can hear little clicks inside my dream. Night drips its silver tap down the back. At 4 a.m., I wake thinking of the man who left in September. His name was Law. My face in the bathroom mirror has white streaks down it. I rinse the face and return to bed. Tomorrow, I'm going to visit my mother. She sent me this and she said, this is my lump. I read this. And so we analyzed it, and I will explain to you what verbal markers she was able to extract from this. But the first thought I had when I read these, they really deeply read. It's a beautiful poem. You can find all of it online somewhere. I remember this painting by Edward Hopper. I don't know why, but it just reminded me of that. So I put it here as well. And so this is what we kind of came up with. Needs related to package one: order, control, calm, and boundaries. So we started from an envelope and ended up with 4 very precise things. She needs to feel that she has some sort of order in her life. She needs to have control. She needs to feel calm, and then she needs to set boundaries. When she says control, what she actually means is what she's able to control and what she isn't, because by default she assumes that she's able to control everything, and then the envelope starts happening when reality hits. So out of that vagueness, four distinct, quite clear needs emerged. And then the second package, the lump, also yielded four needs: finding a partner, because she was divorced and was alone for quite a while; developing the ability to be vulnerable with her friends. One of the important constructs that this client has is strength. She cannot possibly be perceived as weak. So she never shared her struggles with picking with anyone. She never shared her struggles with loneliness with anyone. In fact, until she read the poem and started analyzing the lump, she wasn't able to share her loneliness with herself. Her loneliness was the lump. It just wasn't verbal, right? It was a symptom. It wasn't verbal. And then it was also being more spiritual, because she was a lapsed Catholic. And as we kind of talked, she realized that working on her spirituality, whether through like just rejoining a church or just exploring it on her own, actually made her feel more connected with people. So that was where she actually started, because that was one way to deal with the lump without having to be vulnerable in front of actual human beings, only in front of God, who is omnipotent anyway. So, already knows about the loneliness. So being more spiritual was the starting point from her, and then she worked her way towards other needs. And then there was also being creative. She was kind of like Emily Dickinsonian in the sense that she was writing poetry that she never published and no one knew about. And then she expressed the desire to join or exchange her poetry with other people. So she registered somewhere online, I don't know where she was able to submit some of her poems and then start analyzing them. And then by the end of our work together, she even started talking about perhaps sending her poetry to an actual journal and then maybe having something published. So the lump in her throat, with some patience and careful analysis, and thanks to Anne Carson, yielded all these. I hope you can see how feeling a vague urge, an envelope, a lump, isn't a very useful way to conceptualize something. But when you find a translation that makes sense, then you know how to operationalize it. Boundaries for her meant specifically her children. Because she was divorced and she had full custody of her kids, and her husband lived on the other side of the country, so a few time zones away, she was basically a single parent, and she felt a lot of guilt for it because of the aforementioned spirituality. She didn't feel at a certain level that being divorced is something that's appropriate. So she kind of tried to overcompensate by being the most caring mother. And I'm sure one day one of those kids will say mothering therapy. But she kind of wanted to be there for her children all the time, to the point where she felt guilty when she wasn't doing something for her kids. Like taking care of herself, like being creative, would actually make her feel guilty. So that was a way to set boundaries, to understand that at some point your children have to develop a life of their own, that your children have to understand that your mom is just a human being who is sometimes just not going to be there for you. Not because she doesn't love you, but because she's just not omnipotent. And this was, I think, more of a message for my client to hear than for her kids. But this is something that you can actually practically work with. So this is what arose from the urge. One urge to pick yielded 8 different psychological needs. So you see, when you reduce the urge to something as, like saying this is unreasonable, irrational, stupid, silly, crazy, or whatever word you want to use, you're essentially refusing to get to know yourself. With some patience and some work, she was able to find a lot of useful ways to actually conceptualize this. And then as she began working on these needs, her urges also started to change quality. They started to feel differently. They started to become weaker. As she applied competing responses, obviously she would pick less. And so it opened up this whole way of, of working with the urge, but not seeing it as the enemy, but instead seeing it as the messenger. Someone who carries information about what you need, what's not working, what's missing in your life, or what you have too much of in some cases. So this is where I will stop, and let me just see what time it is. Okay, I was not impossibly long today. I'm going to close the poll before we go to the Q&A, just to see. Oh, everyone's voted. That's perfect. So let's see what we will be talking about in August. Our topic will be picking habits and neuroplasticity. So we will be talking about sort of how habits shape our brain and how neuroplasticity can help us reshape it. And of course, we'll try to situate picking in that context. Let me see what the runner-up topic was. Oh, this was a landslide victory. The runner-up was cognitive diffusion and skin picking. Useful topic, I think. So I will share the results with you in case you're curious. If you have a topic that you would like me to include next time, just put it in the Q&A or email it to me later on. Now, let's go to the Q&A. It looks brown, rusted color, not red. It could be the scan, but let's trust Malevich that he knew how to recognize the color. Yeah, I agree with you though. Thank you. Well, I don't know for what, but you're welcome. Can you please draw the connection to skin picking? Well, I hope the connection was clear by the end of my description. The reason why I used Malevich's work is because when you see a red square on a white surface, you don't necessarily think that this has some sort of profound meaning, and yet it does. And the same thing goes for the urge. That's the parallel. We tend to see it as something irrational, ridiculous, crazy, but if we find proper context for it, then it will sort of reveal itself and make more sense to us. And then we'll be able to deal with it in a healthy way. How can I get professional help that deals with skin picking? Well, our program SkinPick would obviously be one thing. This is the only, to my knowledge, the only online program that you have that's kind of structured and specifically dedicated to skin picking. You can try finding a local therapist, or you can contact the TLC Foundation. From what I know, they have some support groups that you can also attend. So you can just listen, or you can also participate. It just, I guess it depends on you, but they can also perhaps offer some help. They have quite a number of resources on their website, so it can be very useful. Awkward equals gauche in French. I could have just butchered that because French never made any sense to me. If it's not gauche, then I'm very sorry. But apparently there is a direct translation. I'm actually Hungarian, so that was a fun example. Well, there you go. I find Hungarian to be a very fascinating language, and I'm incredibly grateful that I can speak it because you can say things in Hungarian that you can literally not even think in other languages. Like, it's just so beautifully constructed and made. It's just perfection. Is there a list of psychological needs that a majority of people have? This is a good question, and judging by the name, I have a sneaking suspicion that you might be my client in the program. You can go and Google Abraham Maslow. He created a hierarchy of needs. So he listed some of them and kind of created this idea of what's more important than what goes before and above what. I personally don't like to go for any of these universal things. Sometimes they're helpful because they give people, at least like some starting point, some words for them. Oh, I see the next point. So you are my client. So anyway, this is it can give you some vocabulary, but ultimately just focus on your experience, because people are not statistics. Like when we do psychological research, we just kind of measure what's true for most people, but you are not most people, and none of you is most people. You are all you. So in that sense, psychological needs are very personal. So if you Google Abraham Maslow, and I should have perhaps included that as well, this is my mistake, but this is something that can give you a starting point. But try thinking in terms of your own personal experience. And also because Maslow created very general things. Sometimes our needs are not something that maybe other people need. Like there are needs that, like for example, I love to travel. I consider this a legitimate need for myself. In the past year and something that, COVID hit, I couldn't travel as much, and I truly profoundly missed it. I don't think there will be a single psychological study that will say that the need to travel is a universal human need. But for me, it's very real, it's very important, and I just can't not do it. So that's an example of a need that you're not likely to find in a psychological journal. I think the advice you're giving about slowing down to collect information is very good advice. I realized this past week that I cognitize all of my emotions right away and try to figure out verbally what is going on and why. And the cognization actually worsens the picking. I'm skipping what you're saying to do, slowing down and focusing on the nonverbal messages my body is trying to tell me. I mean, I can deeply personally relate to what you're saying because I had to cure myself of that need as well. Like you might have noticed, but I'm a person that likes theory. And when I say theory, I mean I like clarity. I'm the kind of person that reads the most complicated theory and still like end up sketching and defining terms clearly because that's what I need. I like that kind of clarity. But are these parts of our psyche that are not verbal, they really don't care what our conscious mind wants. They just exist the way that they exist. And the difficulty with learning sort of the, let's say, the language of our needs is that this is a language that doesn't really have a dictionary and it doesn't have a grammar book. So you have to go about devising all of that on your own. So I can actually give you a personal example. Well, personal. Um, I remember when I moved to Miami. So I spoke Italian fluently at the time for various reasons, mainly because I needed something to do in medical school that was not related to diseases. So I decided to learn Italian because, why not? It's beautiful. But in Miami, Italian is not very useful. And some days, at least in my neighborhood, English wasn't all that useful either. And the friends that I made were not native English speakers. Um, to this day, most of my friends in Miami just speak Spanish. So that meant that I was kind of thrown into this world where everyone was speaking a different language and I had to learn it. But because I work and, I do have a life, um, I kind of had to learn Spanish on the go. And because I already spoke Italian, I wanted to assume that a lot of these things mean the same thing. And spoiler alert, they don't. So a lot of people, and then also the grammar, I kind of tried to reconstruct it by listening to people. That meant that I made a lot of stupid mistakes and people laughed at me endlessly and we joked about my stupid Yuma Spanish and all these things. But eventually I did end up learning it. It's just that I didn't have time to actually open up a proper book and then read and then learn the grammar the way I would have liked to. So in that sense, this is how learning the language of our needs also works. Like we try something out, it either works and it doesn't work. So we write it down somewhere, make a mental note, try it again, might work, might not work. Sometimes like literally it happened to me, like I would go into a store and then people would start speaking Spanish and then I would think, so I'm just going to Spanishize my Italian. And then, they laugh. I feel like a fool, but we end up communicating. So the reason why I'm saying all this is that this was a way of doing something experientially and not cognitively. Even though the temptation is very strong to learn to just snap find a snappy definition of your need, it actually excludes a lot of it. Rigid definitions are very exclusive. It's good when you do scientific research because you want to make your research as specific as possible, but it's not good when it comes to the human psyche. Like you can feel pressure in your chest and conclude what? That you have generalized anxiety disorder and you need medication. But the pressure in your chest could also mean that maybe now you're tired, that maybe something's weighing heavy on you. There you go. This is one of our unconscious mind tends to be very literal sometimes. So it's enough to just say out loud what's happening in your body and you already understand the need. Yeah. So slowing down is incredibly important, but also very difficult. To me, slowing down is one of like, it's like when you slow down, you've solved half of your problems already. Sorry, I missed the name of the concerto. Yeah, it was Prokofiev's third piano concerto. It's just a stunning masterpiece, just remarkable, brilliant. I mean, you're allowed to hate it though. I like it a lot. Thanks, this has been revealing. What if we misinterpret the needs or translate the wrong message from the urge? This will certainly happen. The same way that I mean, to use an example from Hungarian, but without bothering you with actual, because I'm tempted to speak Hungarian now, but the difference between I want to hug you and I want to kill you is a sound that most foreigners can differentiate. So it's sometimes you will do this. But the thing is, if you misinterpret the need now, that means that your assumption was wrong. You just toss it aside and then find a new one. Do not get attached to your hypotheses. This is what every scientist will tell you. You cannot think that your hypothesis is the truth, because otherwise you're a bad scientist. You have to be able to let it go if it doesn't work. And the way to know if it works is whether or not it alleviates the urge, at least partially. So to use the example of my client, like if the lump is a little less present after something, you're on the right track. If the lump is the same, probably you're off base. If the lump is worse, you're also on the right track, just you're going in the wrong direction. So by the way that the urge changes, or any sensation, you kind of see where you are in relation to it. I hope that makes some sense to you. So I can actually give you again an example for this client. So setting boundaries was one of the things that she verbalized. But the trouble was how to set boundaries. So when she first started setting boundaries, people just got the impression that she was very angry. And especially because she's a woman, you know, when a woman actually wants to set a boundary, society usually tells us that she's angry. It's one of those misogynist things that are kind of built into people by just kind of being alive. And so, like, because for her it was so difficult to say no to things, then she wouldn't say, sorry, I just can't do this today, or I don't feel like it, or that's not something I should be doing. She would say, no, I don't want this. And people would think that she's angry, but she wasn't angry. She was just sort of clumsy in the way in which she was expressing her needs. And frankly speaking, if a man would say no, no one would think that there's anything particularly wrong. So sometimes we have to tweak the way we approach these things. But the only way to know what works is to try things out. And both CBT and constructivism encourage us to experiment and to try new things, because you never know how something will work. So sure, don't be upset with yourself if you come up with the wrong message. That happens. I mean, speaking of Hungarian, I was like the last time I was in Budapest, I bought this bilingual collection of Hungarian poetry. So there was like on one side there's like the Hungarian poem, and then on the right side there's the English translation. And so like I was reading and comparing, and then there was one of the poems that I like very much. It's called, I guess the translation would be The Eternal Anna by Juhas Gyula. He's a Hungarian poet. And so this poem is basically written, in my mind at least, as a prayer. There's a lot of repetition, and the words are very specific. And the way it ends is with amen, which literally means it's a prayer. So he's talking about this girl that he loved and supposedly got over at some point, but then he proceeds to say how she lives basically in every crooked tie, like in every little small aspect of his life, she's still there. But the way that it was written in Hungarian includes a lot of repetition of specific words and sounds. And when you read it, it genuinely sounds like a prayer. But then in translation, they basically kind of altered eliminated this repetition, which literally made me upset. So that was a misinterpretation for me, for example, because it destroyed what I think is the best thing about the poem. It's the tone. It talks about like a juvenile love affair with this solemn, almost religious tone. So that was a misinterpretation for me. But what did I do with it? Well, I was upset by reading it. And then on the side of the book, I just scribbled my own translation into English, which I'm happy to say is better. So yeah, we do that all the time. Not a question, just a comment. This was fantastically interesting. Well, thank you. I'm glad you found it interesting. I had never heard of Anne Carson, thank you. Me neither, and I like poetry, so I read a lot of them. I've never heard of her. And then when I started researching her, she's a true gem if you like contemporary poetry. Do you feel comfortable sharing your email address? It's right there in the left lower corner. If you have any questions about the program or any technical questions, use the support. But if you want to share something with me that you don't feel comfortable sharing with anyone else, that's my email address. What was the Hungarian word? It was a very good word to describe how I feel when picking. Elvagyadás. I hope you got it this time. Is Kelly who you refer to George Kelly? I just wanted to make sure. Yes, George Kelly, the author of the Psychology of Personal Constructs, volumes 1 and 2, published in 1955. The greatest book on human psyche that I've ever read. Actually, to complete my nerdiness, I'm sorry for the digression, I actually have the first edition of it. And another edition because, I just don't want to destroy this one. So yeah, that's George Kelly. Can skin picking be cured or decreased? Yes and yes, the short answer. But I would start with the decrease. I think it's very important whenever you change psychologically, it's important to set proper goals. Setting a goal to never pick again can be very frustrating because that's simply not how most people change. We change sort of slowly, then we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back and so on. So in that sense, it's better to think initially about it as a decrease. What I like to say to clients is, let's say that you set an expectation to decrease your picking by 10% every week. That may sound like it's little to you, but 10% per week means practically no picking in 10 weeks, right? Again, it's never that simple. We go back and forth and we have relapses and we're just messy beings. But I think setting goals like that and achieving them makes for more sustainable change. Because when you say, I will never pick again, or if I do, I have failed, once a relapse happens, even a minor one, you'll just declare yourself a failure. You'll feel bad. That will fuel more picking, and then you will make things worse, not better. So we have to be very strategic about planning change. I got in late, who's Kelly? I believe my enthusiasm from a few seconds ago answered that one, but an American psychologist. Can skin picking be connected with pica? Statistically, I don't know, to be honest, because I have never found any studies that connect the two. I had one case where a client had both, but the client only wanted to work on skin picking. And this was something that they had prior to skin picking in their childhood. So perhaps you can think of it as an evolution in a sense, but I I don't feel comfortable giving a very precise answer on that because I would be frankly making stuff up, and I prefer not to do it if possible. Uh, does the constructivist approach take issue of neurodivergence into account, or is it not so relevant to the project? So Kelly published his book in 1955. I don't think we had the term neurodivergence in 1955, but everything that's alive has constructs, and so do neurodivergent people. So from a constructivist point of view, the question wouldn't even be what the content of those constructs are, because the content is different from everyone. Maybe the question would be, when we say neurodivergent, maybe we're talking about a different way in which someone applies their constructs. Because when Kelly talks about constructs, he talks about several ways of looking at them. One is the content of the construct, like good versus bad, or I don't know, let's say lonely versus connected. Everyone has their own verbal labels for it. So that would be the content. The content is widely different. Some things we share, even if, whether or not you're neurodivergent, because you're in a certain culture, we probably share something. But the way in which we apply constructs is very different. So for example, when we talk about OCD, sometimes what we talk about is people applying constructs in an impermeable and preemptive way. So it would be too much, I think, to define those terms now, but there is what we call the rigidity of thinking, or repetitiveness of these behaviors can sometimes be seen as impermeable constraint. I think you can use constructivism absolutely to work with neurodivergent people, but I think you would have to kind of focus, I guess, depending on the person, you would have to focus maybe on more nonverbal techniques, or I think it's more of a technical issue than it is a theoretical. You absolutely can explain that. And there is actually one paper that just occurred to me. There was one paper published by Harry Proctor about autism. It was published a while ago, and it was his way of trying to not give a definitive constructivist model of it, but to just give hints as to where we can go with it. I've even had that paper somewhere in some PDF somewhere, but I will believe it was published in the Journal of Constructivist Psychology. If you're interested, you can email me and I'll try to find it for you. I can certainly find you the reference, but maybe I can send you the paper. And I'm sure if you write to Harry Proctor that he will send it to you himself. He's a very kind and nice person. Thank you so much. You helped me a lot. You're welcome. I'm from Brazil and I could understand everything. It was very clear to me. God bless you. Well, I'm happy you were able to understand. I know that my approach sometimes seems a little digressive, when I start with Russian avant-garde art, but I usually do, come back to the topic. I'm not yet at the Slavoj Žižek stage where my thinking is just never goes back to the original question. I just like to use examples. Sometimes it's easier to understand a principle on something that's not very personal. So that's one of the reasons why I do it. Could you please comment on competing psychological needs? For example, the need for security versus the need for exploration. Not sure, there's probably a better word. Well, if exploration is your word, then that's your word. But if you replace the word exploration with the word safety, I can give you a book to read. It's very short and very to the point and very interesting. It's Freud's book called The Culture and Its Discontents. It is a very, very short, late work by Freud. You don't need to know basically anything about psychoanalysis to read it. You can find like editions for like $2 and could be in the public domain by now. And Freud, amongst other things, writes about how we have conflicting needs sometimes. And the way he talks about two specific needs. One is our need to be free so that our id could, make all its weird, perverse fantasies come true, like so that we can do whatever the hell we want. And then the opposing need would be to feel safe. So Freud says, sometimes, evolutionarily speaking, we came into groups because we feel safer in groups. But for groups to be sustainable, societies, not just like small groups, we have to have some rules. And as soon as we have some rules, that means that we lose some of our freedom. And then he says that what we always do is kind of balance between the two. Sometimes we want more freedom, and then our society becomes looser. And then sometimes we want more security, then the society becomes tighter. So, for example, the world where Freud lived, or like the Victorian England, which would be the British society at the time, was a society that valued safety over freedom. So you had a lot of rules that people had to follow, right? So for Freud, of course, those restrictions those needs that we have to give up in order to have to feel safe, which is also a need. So to feel safe, you have to give up some of your needs. For Freud, they're mainly sexual, but I don't think this is just because of the time where Freud lived, but I think we can safely generalize and say that it is much more. For example, now you often see in American political discourse, when people talk about speech and things that we can or cannot say or should not say, people will often say, well, your feelings be damned, I want my freedom of speech. I don't care if you feel offended, I want my freedom of speech. So those would be people who would favor their ability to say whatever they want, let's say at the expense of solidarity with other people's suffering, which would give you a sense of safety. So that's also this construct at work. I think it's a very powerful construct, but that would be one example. Our needs and our values come into conflict all the time. So for example, before this webinar began, I had been working since 6 a.m. this morning. So I've had a long day, and I had competing needs from, being responsible and giving the webinar and just, basically sleeping. And then this need won because I felt you can't just not show up, right? But those were competing needs. Not competing, conflicting might be a better word. That happens all the time. This is why when we think about needs, we should not only think about short term, but also the long term. If you balance your needs long term, then these small conflicts become easier to resolve. So in my ridiculous example from true but ridiculous example of wanting to do the webinar and then on the other side just really wanting to sleep, it was very easy to choose the webinar because first I know I'll sleep afterwards, and also I know that on Saturday morning at the end of this week I will go to the beach and I will not use my brain until Monday probably. So I know exactly when I will rest, because in the long run, I always make sure that I don't neglect my own well-being. So when you balance out the needs in the long term, those short-term conflicts are less less intense, but they do happen because we humans are, like I said, very messy and very often very contradictory. I think it's one of this sort of impossibility of being completely coherent is one of the big lessons of constructivism as well, and psychoanalysis. When I pick, I do not feel anything, and I can rarely stop when I think about stopping. Is that normal with skin picking? So what you're describing sounds more like what we call a picking trance. So you can go back, we had a webinar on this topic as well. This is, I wouldn't say that it's something that I hear every day, but it is a fairly frequent description. And perhaps not feeling anything is exactly why picking is so important. Maybe what you would be feeling if you had to feel something would be very difficult. Constructivism, again, always teaches us to think of the opposite. If I choose to go left and not right, that means that left, no matter how painful and difficult it is, has an advantage over the other side. So maybe not feeling is your advantage. I hope that makes sense to you. But yes, this is an experience that people often report. Or they will say that they feel a kind of relief or even gratification. If you taught a course in linguistics, I would happily take it. Well, if I were qualified to teach one, I would happily teach it. Usually When I teach, it's usually either mindfulness or something related to constructivism. I don't like to go into topics that I'm not an expert on, but I do like languages, because I don't know. I just grew up around many languages, so it became something, it's kind of part of me. Any suggestion about how to support your partner accept the diagnosis of skin picking rather than focus on a purely dermatological issue? Well, the first thing I would say is just listen. Last month, we actually talked about this, but from the perspective of people who struggle with skin picking. It is very difficult to accept that. And even sometimes people start therapy and they struggle to accept it. So just be patient and be very supportive and ask your partner what they need at this time. Because what they might need could be something that you can't even, fathom or assume. They can find literature or resources themselves. I'm guessing everyone knows how to Google. Just listen to what they have to say. That really, and honestly, this is the best piece of advice I can give you. Just make sure to tell them that anytime they want to talk about it, you're there, and just let them talk when they feel like it. You cannot force acceptance. It happens when it happens. What's the best way to interrupt a picking session? So depends on the type of picking session that you're talking about. If you're talking about those intense trance-like sessions, they're extremely difficult to stop, and usually you need something very intense, like a cold shower, for example. Like those are those sessions when you lose track of time, or you need someone externally to pull you out of it. But if we're talking about a typical picking session, like a focused picking session, then implementing a simple competing response will do. And if you want to learn more about that, we had a quote, I think at this point, my brain just does not speak a single language. We had a webinar on habit reversal training where I talked about competing responses. So that's something that you can try. Usually when I recommend these techniques, I like it to be something very simple and very accessible, and not too many of them, because people sometimes feel very enthusiastic and then they say, I will try 20 techniques at once. And that usually results in failure because no one can possibly implement 20 things at the same time. How to deal with family who struggle to accept that it's something I just can't control? This is a very common question. Well, one thing is to provide them with the resources. You can go to the TLC website. They have these kind of information sheets where this is clearly underlined. You can ask them to email our support team and ask for information. Our support team also includes psychologists, so they can also answer this question and they will explain it. You can refer them to one of the webinars that we've had. Like basically just you can provide them information. But what I would think is more important is how to protect yourself in these situations. In the sense that sometimes people simply won't accept our view of the world, not necessarily about skin picking, about whatever else. And we have to be okay with them not being okay with it. So give them the information so that if they're willing and open, they can learn, but protect yourself. Because you're the one who has to deal with picking. You shouldn't have to deal with the frustration of people who are not willing to accept. Not a question. We share the same last name, but we use the H. Thank you. Oh, that's interesting. I don't know that I've ever met anyone. Well, my last name, like the end of my last name is quite common, but I've never met anyone with my well, except for my sister. That's very nice to hear. Gosh, learn to pronounce. So I'm guessing I messed up the pronunciation. Oh, sorry, I speak several languages fluently. French is not one of them. My grandmother was a French teacher, and when I was little, she tried to teach me French. And then at one point, she told me, maybe you should consider something simpler like Esperanto. So I never kind of went back to French. That is sadly a true story. But the definition would be lacking ease or grace, unsophisticated, and socially awkward. I guess that would cover most of the awkwardness. If we were to log urges to pick on our own, what should we write down besides physical sensation? Place, time, thoughts, what are we doing? So you can install our self-monitoring app. It's free. We don't take your data. It's all on your phone, so it's perfectly private. And you have already predefined variables. But if you want to do it on your own, I wouldn't necessarily log time. Maybe evening, morning, like that distinction can be important because people tend to pick more when they're tired in the evening or in the morning when they look in the mirror during their morning routine. I would definitely log thoughts. And so thoughts, sensations, and place. And that those would be the basic ones. And then I would give myself, let's say, a week or two of logs. And then I would see what's the most, like where I find the most useful information. And then I would refine my logging based on this. I do the same thing for people who are my clients in the program. Sometimes I don't like, I will ask them to self-monitor as much as they can for 1 week. And then when we review the data, I will tell them, okay, so maybe just monitor this or that, or pay attention to this or add this, because based on the real life data, you can tweak it. But usually the most, in my experience, the most important aspect to think about is not what happens during or after, as much as it is what's happening just before. What were your thoughts just before? What were your feelings just before? Were you talking about someone? Did you think about someone or something? So those would be the most important things in my experience. So it might not be the case for everyone, but with clients, I've noticed that this is where we find the most useful stuff. Do you ever see clients who have psychogenic seizures along with skin picking? I have never had a client with that combination, although I have had a client with psychogenic seizures a few years ago, but never the combination of the two. Fantastic talk, thank you. Well, thank you for your compliment. My skin picking only occurs on thumb cuticles when there is loose skin, etc. When the skin is smooth, I usually don't feel the urge to pick. Once the picking starts, nothing can stop the action until it bleeds. How does this type of picking fit with your approach? So in terms of the theory, I think all of it applies. Even if you don't feel the urge, you can associate it. So this is specifically a webinar devoted to urges. We've had webinars that deal with other topics as well. You can look into your thoughts or simply just really look at what you feel in your body. That's also sufficient. Look at what you're doing. If it's not the urge, there has to be something that starts an action, right? So everything's caused by something. So there are other places to look. This specific webinar dealt with the urges. I'm not that pretentious to think that one webinar will give a definitive answer to everything. But in practical terms, what I would advise you to pay attention to is stimulus control rather than competing responses, because when picking is mindless, kind of unconscious, automatic, then it's easier to, let's say, wear gloves or cover the finger or something, because that physically prevents you from doing it. So you decondition yourself in a way by doing this. I was a patient in front of an acupuncture class, and the lead teacher asked what were the marks on my legs. Was it stress, which is something they were treating me for? I voiced this. She put her hand on my leg, and it was a huge step of voicing where this comes from. Feeling so much better from being on SkinPick really changed things for me. Well, I'm glad that the program helped for you. And what you're describing here sounds actually like a very nice way of de-shaming, if that's even a word, and also maybe kind of getting in touch with your skin in a compassionate way, which I can see how it could be very useful. So thank you for sharing that. just to clarify, when you say slow down, do you mean realize you're about to pick, try hard not to pick, and focus on what you're feeling at the moment? Is this correct, or am I missing something? So when I say slow down, I meant when, if you're trying to understand like what the urge is about, don't try to define everything right now. Observe. That's what I was trying to say. You don't need to have all the answers now. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And that's mostly always the case when it comes to human psychology. That's what I meant. But when the urge arises, by all means, take care of yourself. There are many ways that you can do that. You can use cognitive diffusion, which was one of the proposed topics here. You can use different competing responses. You can use different stimulus control. You can use breathing, grounding, relaxation techniques. Like there are a million things that you can and should do. What I meant was, in order to understand the needs behind the urge, to kind of slow down and not jump to conclusions. But when it comes to taking care of yourself, um, I mean, take care of yourself. The question about neurodivergency makes me think of ADHD. I would predict that those with higher ADHD would be more prone to skin picking because of the trances and hyperfocus, perhaps also the dopamine hit thoughts. Um, I haven't seen any studies, but I have seen literally dozens, if not hundreds, of clients who have both ADHD and skin picking. Yes. And I've also seen that mindfulness helps them with both at the same time if introduced slowly, because it improves your focus and awareness and kind of helps you be more proactive about your experience. Because both ADHD and skin picking also share a kind of impulsivity. So that's also another thing that they have in common. But absolutely, yes. I have even seen cases where skin picking tends to be exacerbated by, like, you know, those moments, if you're taking any medication for ADHD, especially the stimulant medication, you know, that moment when the dose starts wearing off, that's where some people experience very intense picking episodes. And I've also seen, although rarely and inconsistently, that sometimes medical treatment for ADHD can complicate or worsen skin picking, although, you know, that's always a very complicated decision to make, because you can't exactly stop taking ADHD medication if you need to be functional. So it's a difficult situation. But absolutely, I've seen it together many times. Someone says civilization and its discontents. Oh, did I say culture and its discontents? Sorry. Yes, I meant civilizations. Yeah, this is because in German it's das Ubenhagen in, nor what in den, but it's culture in German, in den Kultur, yeah. But it's civilization and its discontents. My apologies. And forgive me, Father Freud. That book is really amazing. I truly, truly love that book. Um, Heroin, alcohol, other afflictions and addictions, they say cut it out like it's cancer. So skin picking seems to be really unique. And the stereotype is that girls self-cut and hide it out on contrived constructs. When they pick their face, it seems extreme. So I wouldn't equate drug addiction or alcoholism with skin picking. I think, I mean, they're treated differently. They belong to different categories. Even from a constructivist standpoint, maybe we can say that they have some similarities in terms of alcohol also being a unique resource to deal with a need. But I think prognostically and treatment-wise, they're very different. And when it comes to skin picking, I have had clients who say, so now I joined the program, so I will stop picking immediately. And well, I will be frank, that usually backfires very quickly. So I think when it comes to heroin, even there, you don't just stop using heroin and then just go about your day. It's a complicated, because of the biological reactions that it causes. It's neither harmless nor quick. It's something that's done in very controlled conditions. So I wouldn't recommend that. I mean, you can try and stop picking, but I think there will come a point where you will have a relapse. I would say more gradual approach is better, and also more compassionate. Because when you gradually reduce picking, you're less likely to have those extremely intense urges. Because why would you cause yourself more suffering? I mean, isn't the goal of change to suffer less, not more? So if you do it 10% at a time, is it's much more sustainable. Who was that you mentioned who never goes back to the original question? By the way, I love your approach and thank you for an interesting user presentation. Well, thank you. The person I mentioned was Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher and psychoanalyst. Like he's the kind of person when you ask him, how are you? And 2 hours later, he's talking about Hegelian philosophy and he never answered your question. He's like this wealth of information. Unless he's talking about Buddhism, then he really doesn't know what he's talking about. But if you want to learn about, I don't know, like he's a leftist philosopher. So you want to learn about connections between Marx and Freud and Hegel and all these people, he can teach you a lot, but none of it will be coherent. And he's basically like a walking digression, but an extremely intelligent man. Even when I disagree with him, he's still quite intelligent. So the full Proctor article is available on ResearchGate, and thank you very much for your answers. Yeah, like I said, Harry Proctor is a really nice guy, and I've had the pleasure of meeting him a few times. Back when I was in training to become a therapist, I attended his workshops and then in conferences, and he's very available, very accessible, and just a very, very nice person. So he does tend to share a lot of his work to make it available. Constructivists in general, I find are like that. Thank you for today's webinar. I have some new concepts to explore. I'm looking forward to next month's webinar. Well, thank you very much. And I am also looking forward to it because neuroplasticity is a fascinating topic. Glad the webinar won in the end. Well, I mean, I'm happy you're glad, and I think it's a nice topic, but that was not my personal favorite. But since this is about the topics that you care about, then that's what we'll be talking about. So in other words, some of the processes for getting over these problems say, no, you can't do it today. Your take that says 10% a day or a week is tenable, I think my daughter can grasp it, but if we don't solve the root problem, anxiety, etc., can it stick? So if you think that your daughter picks her skin because the anxiety is the main problem, then address both. Which one you choose to address first is the one that's more severe. If she can work on both at the same time, excellent. The reason why I suggest 10% reduction, it's like you can do 15, 5, whatever works. 10% is just like a number. The point is that it's gradual. If your daughter is younger, so I don't know what her age is, establish a reward system, for example, that if she reduces weekly by 10%, then she gets something. If she has a picking free day, she gets something. The reason for this, and this goes for adults as well, is that our brain is more likely to reinforce certain behaviors if they come with rewards rather than with punishments. So you're more likely to form a new habit if you validate yourself than if you are angry with yourself. This is why I repeat like a crazy person on every webinar and to every client in the program is be compassionate and be kind and be nice to yourself, because that is the way to get better. Ultimately, compassion is about wanting to alleviate suffering. If you don't have that, then what is it that we're doing here? Like, what is this dance that we're doing? So validate, establish a reward system, and make sure that if we say 10% less, that it is measurable in some way, so that it's not up to her making up, the numbers. Maybe she can use like this app or some other tracking app so that you can actually see a reduction. Or maybe if she picks her pimples, I don't know, like you can, if you don't pick for a week, or if you pick 10% less, that should also be reflected somehow to a degree on your face, but make sure to operationalize it. What if you don't know why you pick? That's fine. As a human being, I like to know why I do things, but even if you don't know all the techniques from SkinPick or other CBT techniques are equally applicable. To use habit reversal training or acceptance and commitment therapy, you don't need to know the root cause of anything. And also, in the beginning of therapy, no one knows the root cause of anything. So relax, take it one step at a time, and start with what you do know. And you certainly know something. So you might know what your trigger is, you might know what feels similar. There's your starting point, and see where that takes you. It's okay not to know. I mean, ultimately, because we change so much, all our knowledge has expiration dates, even when it's supposedly objective. Just look at science. Like when I don't look at physics today and 300 years ago, you can't exactly use some of these, in reference to current papers. We learn more, so reject for older knowledge. The universe changes itself, so we kind of have to adapt. It's just knowledge has expiration date, sadly. How to see prior webinars. I understand now why my sessions are so hard to stop. I need a strong counter response to get out of the trance. So all the webinars are on the SkinPick's YouTube channel. And in a couple of days, you will receive a link to this one as well when it's uploaded. And then once it's uploaded, you can simply access the channel and that's it. Not a question, but it's very comforting to hear someone talk so normally about this topic, so thank you. Well, you're welcome. I'm glad that I guess the way I understand this is that it kind of helps maybe reduce the shame or the stigma around it. And if that's the case, that gives me a truly immense pleasure. Sometimes I think the guilt and the shame are harder to deal with than picking itself. Hilarious summary of Zizek. Well, I mean, I like the guy, but find me a thought that actually has a beginning, middle, and the end, Even his books are that way. His editors must be very happy. I didn't mean to criticize your pronunciation of, I'll say it again, gosh, just to let you know that we use the same word in English to be more specific. Oh, okay. It's okay if you criticize it. I'm not very sensitive to these things. I mean, I don't even speak French, so the fact that I pronounced it correctly was really just an accident. So it's fine to criticize me. I mean, my own mom criticized me for how I forgot cases in Serbian the other day, but that was just because I was tired. I mean, I swear I know my grammar in those languages that I do speak. But sometimes because I speak so quickly, I will say so much nonsense that I can't even be upset when people criticize. That's normal. And it's not personal. Personal anecdote about ADHD and skin picking. I have both, and I think that the hyperfocus I experienced during picking is definitely a partial cause for entering a picking trance. My brain is very scattered, and it is a relief to be able to not think about anything else for a while. It makes it easy to get stuck there. Oh, I absolutely think you're spot on. I think a lot of people can relate to this. Yes, there are people who actually describe skin picking as being meditative because of how it focuses your attention to something. Or someone said that they don't feel anything. There are people who say that they don't have any thoughts. Just wanted to share. Also, this is the person from above. Since someone asked a question about ADHD and skin picking, by all means, I'm always happy. So this is something for future webinars as well. You're always welcome to share your experiences. You don't have to have a question. It's perfectly okay to share your reflection on what I wrote, if it resonates with you and how it resonates with you. I think people appreciate to hear other people's stories. In fact, sometimes I think this is why I mention our forum from time to time, is because I think just hearing, like, without the psychological stuff and the therapy stuff, just hearing that someone else has similar thoughts and issues, it just helps. And not just for skin picking, but for anything. When we feel alone with something, it's very easy to feel like we're weird. Like, I remember that was extremely long. I was still in medical school. I just started medical school. And I was also starting to learn Italian. And I was a poor student who couldn't afford anything. So I somehow saved up the money to go to Italy so that I can practice my Italian. And ignorant as I was, I decided to go to Sicily. I mean, I love Sicily. It's my favorite part of Italy. I just love, love, love it. I have a house there. It's just my place. Love it. However, the Italian that is spoken in Sicily is not exactly what you learn in language schools. So I ended up being very desperate when I wasn't able to understand anything. But, anyways, as you can notice, my tastes are, I'm not a pretentious person, but my tastes are snobbish to the point of being like stereotypically snobbish even. And so most of the time I can't really share my music tastes with, I can use it as an example here, but it's not like I have a dozen friends that I can call and say, did you hear how Yuja Wang played Chopin? Wasn't that just, worse than what, I don't know, Raphael Blechach did? No one cares. My friends just don't care. My friends care about, I don't know, whatever other people listen to, Lady Gaga or whatever. But anyways, so that's a part of my life that's obviously not the same as skin picking, but where I kind of feel lonely sometimes because I can only talk to myself. And on that trip to Italy, I remember I sometimes have these moments where I practice not being introverted. And I remember I wanted to go to Etna, to the volcano, but I refused to pay like this insane sum of money to be driven in, to the edge of an active volcano. I thought it was like paying for suicide. So I decided that I'm going to find someone who's going to take me there for free. And so I just found like a random person. This guy, the only thing I saw was he's shorter than me, which isn't difficult in Italy. Um, so if it comes to a conflict, I can win. So I just basically approached him. I said, "Hello, can you just take me up the volcano?" He looked at me and said, "Fine, let's go." And so we did. And in the car, I took a look at the CDs that he had, and there was a CD of Bach's partitas. Not the interpretation that I like, that CD, but nonetheless, I saw it and I looked at him and I thought, "You're going to be my best friend," because it was so rare and such a rare resource. So, like when people share and he did become a very good friend, and we're still very good friends. But when people share something so precious, whether it's something precious because it's rewarding or precious because it's a problem, but nonetheless very important, it does give a special flavor that I think no expert can give. So share your stories and I will read them here happily. And maybe next time I can also activate the chat so that you can talk amongst yourselves. Do you think maybe that would be a good idea? Because we used to have that and I don't know, someone started spamming the chats, so we turned it off. I thought maybe that could also help out for you to exchange stories, because definitely I would like this to be a space for that stuff as well. I count number of spots down to 10% of the beginning, but I feel like I'm holding on to the remainder. Well, first of all, that means that you've reduced your picking by 90%. So congratulations, because that's a big deal. And if you are holding on to the 10%, well, that's an interesting thing to reflect on. Like in terms of the onion, what's like what's the layer of the onion that was left unpeeled? I mean, I can't give you an answer since I'm not psychic, but it's definitely something to think about. So this is the last question, and before another one arrives, I think this is a good time to end. And gosh, we've been at this for over 2 hours, so um, thank you for sticking with me for so long. And well, I hope to see you in August, and we will be talking about skin picking and habits and neuroplasticity. Have a pleasant evening or whatever part of the day it is where you are. Bye.